Hello, viewers. Welcome to Legendary Games. That's the podcast we are doing, Sascha and me. Hi. We have a very famous guest today on our show, and we are happy to introduce Mr. Falstein from the US, who has made some iconic games, especially the Indiana Jones series, which we are going to focus today.
Hi,
Hello,
Mr. Great to be here.
It's an honor for us to have you here. Well, your origins in the gaming industry are, more than a few decades. So you already started within the 80s doing games. Can you tell us how you made your first steps in the gaming industry and how you ended up on LucasArts in the 80s?
Sure. Well, excuse me. I actually am just about to hit the 39th anniversary of my professional work in the games industry. I started in early February 1980, so it's been a very long time. I think what really got me launched in my career was that I started to work with computer games at my university in the late 70s, not thinking that it was a job opportunity, but just because it was a fun thing and a good way to learn computer programming and integrate the physics and astronomy that I was learning at school. And I just got very lucky in that one of my professors had been taking a part-time job at Milton Bradley, a company that was better known for jigsaw puzzles and cardboard games, but they were experimenting with electronic games. And right after graduation, I was able to start there as an engineer and stayed with the games industry ever since. The Lucasfilm, LucasArts connection came a few years later in, I guess 1983 is when I got a call from David Fox, who was one of the first few people at the Lucasfilm Games Group. And they had yet to announce their first game, so I was totally surprised that Lucasfilm even had a group doing computer games. And this was at the height of the first set of Star Wars movies, and they had recently released the first Indiana Jones movie, and it was just an absolute dream place to work. You know, it was very exciting to hear that they had a possibility. I was actually contacted because a friend of mine was interviewing with them, and she didn't get the job, but about 6 months later, when I started looking myself, because I was in the arcade industry at that point and it wasn't doing very well. It had a collapse in the early 80s. And I contacted David and he said that they were hiring again, and I came out for an interview and it went very well, and started in, February 1984. So been a very long time since I began work there.
Well, that's 35 years from now on. So you had things were coming and going, like the home computer scene, some of the consoles, the gaming market itself has changed. So we have questions for that as well, if we have enough time for doing so. But like I told you before, we are going to focus on the Indiana Jones series because we were looking for a game. We wanted to research, and Sascha was a great fan of the Indiana Jones movies and franchise. And he said, okay, let's have a look on the Indiana Jones games, especially because he said everybody has talked about Indiana Jones 4, which is a very good game. And he said the lost gem inside of the series is not Indiana Jones 4, it's Indiana Jones 3. So our question would be, when did Lucasfilm Games decided to do that game? When did they start doing the adventure? I've read in the case before that you had around roughly 10 months for developing the game, and you were 3 designers doing the game at that time. So normally you have a longer schedule of planning doing such a program, such a professional high production game. Maybe you can tell us something about the backgrounds and the links to the entertainment industries, meeting George Lucas, having talks to the actors. Did they know that you were doing a game, or was it just part of the merchandising like it was with many of the games back in the days in the 80s?
Well, let's see. I think the best place to start is that when I joined Lucasfilm Games, and we didn't become LucasArts until I think around 1990, but Lucasfilm Games was not even able to work on Star Wars or Indiana Jones licenses at first, because before George decided that he wanted his own games group, the licensing group at Lucasfilm had already tied up the rights for both of those franchises with other companies.
The action game?
No, actually, this was these were games for, like, I think Intellivision and some of the earliest consoles.
I see.
And of course, the Star Wars game, Atari had the license to do the arcade game. There was the Trench Warfare Star Wars game that was very famous at the time. So it was several years before we even had a chance to do games based on Lucasfilm movies. We did do a game based on the movie Labyrinth that was made by Lucasfilm, but wasn't really one of the core films that George had come up with, like Star Wars and Indiana Jones. But then I don't remember the exact circumstances. I think what happened is when Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade was being filmed, we thought that we were still unable to make games based on that. And something must have happened in the licensing department. I forget exactly what it was, but they approached us and said, and this would have been, I think, around September of 1988, they told us that the movie was due to come out the following May, and it looked like we could get the rights to do a game, and were we interested? And as you suggest, the licensing group tended to look at video games as just one more way to spread interest in the movie. And in fact, at one point, probably right around then, we had been told the somewhat depressing news that, even though the games had been doing fairly well by the games industry standards, Lucasfilm probably made more money licensing Star Wars pajamas alone than they did from all of the games that they had sold. So that was part of why, in proportion, it just was not really on their radar screen. But we heard that it was a possibility, and I was the project leader that had some available time. I had just finished, let's see, I think it would have been a game called Strike Fleet at the time. That was one of our simulation games. And Steve Arnold, our boss, asked me to take a look at it. And I spent about 2 months working on a design and trying to get something ready. But as you say, I mean, typically it would take us at least a year, sometimes up to 18 months to do a game at that time, which was a little bit long for the industry, but we put more effort into our games than a lot of other companies did. And so being given only about 9 months, at first I thought maybe there was a way that I could do a sort of shortcut version, but just didn't seem possible. And it was also very challenging trying to think about how to make a puzzle game based on a movie when it seemed that most of the solutions to the puzzles would be obvious from anyone who watched the movie, and we expected almost everybody who played the game would have been a fan of the movie. So that was a very difficult problem. And I went back to Steve after a month or two and told him I just didn't think I was going to be able to get the game done without a lot more high-level help. And our other two most experienced adventure game developers were David Fox and Ron Gilbert, who had done, respectively, Zach McCracken and Maniac Mansion at that point. And they were both working on other projects, just starting up other projects. But we talked about it and realized that this was such a great opportunity to do an Indiana Jones game that we had to see if we could really figure out a way to speed it up. So it was a really unprecedented move in having the three of us work on it as co-designers and co-project leaders. And normally we would have one leader, and sometimes we did two, but we'd never tried three. And it was the only game we actually had three project leaders on a co-equal basis. But it worked out quite well, and we pushed really hard. We tried to come out at the same time as the movie, which is the end of May in '89, and we didn't quite make that. I think the game came out in July of '89, but happily the movie was still in the theaters worldwide pretty much the whole summer, so that wasn't much of a problem. And by standards of the games industry, it was a very fast development effort, and certainly games based on movies were usually done as an afterthought, and sometimes came out even a year or two after the movie had come out at that point. So we were very happy to get the game out while it was still in the theaters.
I'm asking you that question because in Germany we always had a delay with the starting points of the movies. So the movie went off in summer, so your game was released at the same time like the movie was released here, roughly. I have seen another interview with you where you were talking about the credits and that you were switching it up in a random way, so that it depends on who you are going to. When you start the game, it depends if you are named first, or David Fox or Ron Gilbert is named first, and the same with the end screen. So there's some kind of algorithm. Was it kind of an Easter egg for you as a developer integrating this, or was it like, it should be not your fame, it's our fame?
Well, it was I think a surprisingly smooth project, given that there were three of us who were sharing this responsibility, and that it was under such a tight time schedule. And we were friends. We've remained friends since then. Ron and David collaborated on Thimbleweed Park just the last few years, and I helped test that game a little bit. And each of the three of us has collaborated with the other on various projects. Ron and I must have worked on 5 or 6 different games since LucasArts, and most of the ones that happened at LucasArts, we certainly brainstormed together. We're very good at understanding each other's thoughts. So the credit situation was a little more complex. That the opening credits we modeled after the beginning of the movie, where you see Indiana Jones as a Boy Scout in the past. And one of the first things that happens in that movie is a circus train goes by. So we put the credits on the side of a circus train. We didn't really have time to have gameplay in that era. We thought it would be interesting, but we ran out of time for it. And the way we set it up was that I think it was that my name was on the bottom, David's was in the middle, and Ron's was on the top. But it came on left to right, and they were slanted. So you saw my name first and Ron's name last. And David was in the middle no matter which way you saw it. And then at the end of the game, we used a random number generator, and our names came up in a random order. And given that we were all programmers and we were all programming on the game, even though we generally trusted each other, just in the spirit of playing pranks on each other, we wanted to make sure that, I think we double and triple checked to make sure that nobody had put something in there, for example, where it was random until the game had been released for 2 weeks and then suddenly put someone else's name first. But nobody cheated, and even now, 35 years after the game came out, it still seems to be in good working order and random that way. But we had just a few cases where we couldn't agree on things, and for the most part, it was actually a very smooth process and a lot of fun to kind of challenge each other, for each of us to try and get the other to do their best work and improve on what they were doing.
So I read. Sorry. Yeah. I read. Okay. I read that your first concept wasn't an adventure. It was like a book and like make your own adventure version.
Well, that's the thing, is that when it was just my first design, I was trying some different ideas. The thing I was really struggling with was this idea that the paradox of if we based it closely on the movie, everyone would know exactly what to do and how the game would come out. And if we diverged from the movie, people would be frustrated because it was a game based on the movie. And what we came up with among the three of us was the solution that I think worked much better than the sort of choose your own adventure. And that was to essentially put the puzzles in between the scenes in the movie. So, there was quite a bit in the film that sort of skipped over different pieces or only gave you a very quick glimpse of things. And we talked to George Lucas about it. He wasn't very heavily involved in our development because he really was not much of a game player. Steven Spielberg actually played the game a lot more than George Lucas did, and we got to give him hints, as a direct hint line. So that was a lot of fun. But George told us that he was fine with us doing whatever we wanted with Indiana Jones, and even if we wanted to have him die in the game, that was fine. And we were quite surprised that he was being so generous that way. But it meant that we still had the responsibility of figuring out how to be entertaining and not give away the secrets. And by blending some of the scenes in the movie with scenes we imagined that could have happened in between the two, or one of the breaks we had that at first was a problem but turned into a positive is that we only had the original script for the movie for most of the time we were developing the game. We asked a few times if we could watch some of the filming or see some of the early versions, but because the game was so unimportant compared to the filmmaking, we never really got permission. It wasn't that they really didn't want us to, but as they were so busy trying to get the movie out on time, they didn't want to slow down and share it with us. And so it wasn't until I think early May, it was about 3 weeks before the movie came out in the theaters in the US, that we had a special pre-release screening. And they would often give us an early release as a company. And in fact, there's a theater here, I still live near where I worked at Lucasfilm, that Saturday morning they would invite the whole company to come out. And it's a big 1,000-seat theater that the entire company and people's families would show up, and we would see the movie for free on Saturday morning before they opened up their normal matinee schedule. But we actually got a special showing a few weeks even before that because we were eager to see if there was anything that had changed. And it turned out that several of the scenes that were in the script had been filmed for the movie, but then were cut from the film. And we had based some of the gameplay on that. And our first reaction was to be horrified because we thought that, now we're going to be completely out of sync with the movie. But we realized it was fairly minor, and even better, we realized it was kind of a feature of the game. So we advertised it as having, a chance to see exactly these deleted scenes. There was a fairly elaborate bit at the beginning of the movie about Indiana Jones in his school being the boxing coach, and that was why boxing and fighting was such a key part of the game. And of course, it was a way of their explaining why Indiana Jones is so good at fist fighting. But I think I talked to one of the people who worked on the film, and they decided that it slowed down the movie too much, so they cut those scenes out. But we were able to have a lot of that byplay in the game, and it meant for an easy way to do a tutorial on how to use the fist fighting, for example. But it was a lot of fun. There's also a scene, a fairly critical scene that was to take place on the Zeppelin, where Indiana Jones finds the radio room, knocks out the radio operator, and breaks the radio, and goes back to his father, says everything's fine, and they have the scene of him talking to his dad, but they don't talk about the radio. And then when the Zeppelin starts to turn around and Indiana Jones in the movie is really shocked, it's because he thought that he'd broken the radio and there was no way that they could have heard to come back to Berlin. But in another cut scene, you see him look in at the radio room, and they've put the radio back together, very quickly. And there is one line in the movie where they're getting into the biplane and Zeppelin, and Indiana Jones turns to his father and says something about how, I didn't think they would fix it so quickly, and it goes by so fast that you don't really notice it, but that was a reference to the scenes that they had deleted.
Ah, I see. Well, I've seen the movie for the preparation again, and I've realized that the first 20 minutes of the movies, the Cross of Coronado isn't appearing in the adventure. I've already noticed it back in the days. So it starts with him coming wet to the university, changing clothes, and then you had the boxing scene. And shortly after that, you had some of your infamous code copy protections. And I always thought, even back then, that they had some certain charming way in being introduced in the game very well. So that was the same for having the code requests on Indiana Jones 3, where you had a short demo if you were doing the wrong answers. So how much time did the developers spend on the code design for copy protection, or was it just like, oh, we need a copy protection, we have 48 hours? I exaggerate, I know. What might be a good idea to do so? But because it always looks so smoothly integrated in the game, like hanging a pirate or having some other questions which were pretty much fitting to the topics, to the theme.
Well, we did care a lot about that. You know, it was difficult because piracy was sometimes a major problem for some of the games. It was very hard to get the figures, and of course it's hard to know if somebody who pirated the game would have paid for the game if they didn't have access to the pirate version. But estimates went from, you know, as little as 10% to as much as 90% of the revenue being, you know, sucked away by pirates. I know Sierra Online had, I think, an even bigger problem than we did. And so we took it very seriously, and we had to make the copy protection as safe as possible. But we also felt that it was a problem because, of course, if you bought the game and you had the code wheels or the passwords or whatever, it was very annoying to have to go through all of that when you were actually a legitimate owner, and to prove that, you know, it was a shame that the burden was on the people who actually had paid money for the game. And so we felt it was our responsibility to make that as much fun as possible. So yes, we actually spent a lot of time in advance, you know, that because the copy protection always depended on some kind of physical printed material that was included in the game. We couldn't just do it at the last minute. That took many weeks, sometimes months, to actually prepare it and make sure that everything lined up properly on those wheels. And so we had to actually plan that far in advance, and it was quite difficult to work it into the game and have that be included in time. So, you know, I don't remember specifically for Last Crusade, because we, you know, with each new game we had to sort of escalate and figure out better ways to do it. The main thing that we did with The Last Crusade, of course, was that the Grail Diary was in the movie, and we thought that that was a great way to have an inclusion in the box that added value. And as it happened, the author who wrote most of the text for the Grail Diary that was in the game was actually my brother. I volunteered that he might be a good person to hire for it, and of course there was some skepticism about nepotism and whether it was just that, you know, my brother was a writer and I wanted to get some work for him. But he had actually been a medieval history major as well as you know, a freelance writer. And because of his background and his interest in medieval history, it was just perfect for the to be a realistic writer of you know, sort of Henry Jones's Grail Diary. And we also prevailed upon our resources at Skywalker Ranch. We went into a lot of research on the kinds of things that Indiana Jones, well, actually that Henry Jones Sr. would have had around 1910 to 1930 as he was doing his research into the Grail. And for example, in the Grail Diary, there's a telegram from Italy from, I don't know, 1912 or so. And we were actually able to find an example of pictures of what telegrams from Italy looked like at that time. I think we were off by a few years, but that was, still better than I think most people would have expected. And I love the fact that we tried to get as much attention to detail, even into something as simple as, one page of the diary that was, didn't even figure into the video game, but was just part of the copy materials that way.
I see. Well, like I said, it's always a high quality of design, and always ran smoothly into the gaming process, because I always hated those type the 14th page, third paragraph, line 4, word 8, or it was like you can do it once or twice. But nowadays I would uninstall it because of this. And when I look back on the old programs, when I run the DOS box and I start a LucasArts adventure, I do not have the material anymore, but I remember it, and it has a kind of entertaining feeling, which is very rare for a code wheel or for anything like that, because it fits so well to the topic.
Well, Indiana Jones was particularly good for that because, of course, so much of the movies had elements of him trying to decipher codes or riddles from the past. So at least that was better than a lot of the other cases.
That's true. But it worked out in a lot of Lucasfilm games and LucasArts adventures. The only code encryption I didn't like was Zack McCracken, where you had to put those signs at the airport. And that was a bit strange.
Well, so that was only the second one we did, and we were still learning, and we got some very angry feedback about that, I think. So that was one of the things we tried to...
I wasn't enthusiastic about it, so... well, like you had the script and you said, okay, we've seen the movie 3 weeks before, and you had some extras because they deleted some scenes, and I think the boxing scene at least is a very good tutorial in the beginning. I've had another source where you said Pirates was some kind of, Sid Meier's Pirates was some kind of your inspiration for that, but if you know that inspiration source, it feels like, okay, it's Pirates. You can beat him in the face or in the stomach or down to his knees, where you had the swords fight. But I think the fighting inside of the Indiana Jones series is pretty difficult without saving loading. And especially on Indiana Jones 3, The Last Crusade, I struggled with having the perfect dialogue to skip those fights. Let's say to prank a Nazi in the Schloss, in the castle, to advance in the story. I think that was pretty difficult, fighting it 2 or 3 times when you were wrong. And that was kind of, I have mixed feelings about it, because it was an entertaining action sequence and you could work on it, becoming better and better in the fights. But you had a lot of fights in some of the chapters. So,
well, we were under a lot of pressure. On the one hand, we wanted to make the games fun and add new features, new rooms, but we were constrained very heavily by the amount of memory in the machine, the size of the disks, the time that we had to develop it. And we often had talks among ourselves about the sort of value for time that we were getting. And so, for example, there were some things that were relatively easy to program and we could put together very quickly, but could take a long time for someone to get through. And that was important because a lot of people rated the games in those days by how many hours of gameplay they got. And if you didn't have about 40 hours of gameplay, then a lot of people were very unhappy. And we always thought that was kind of strange, because you would, go to a movie and, it's not like you were saying, well, that movie was only 2 hours long. I didn't enjoy it. If it had been 10 hours long, then I would have had a great time. That it felt like forcing the games to be as long as that was sort of unnatural. And I think in modern day, it's gotten much better in that you have some casual games where it's very quick, and you can play an entire game in minutes and repeat it. Or even games that you don't repeat. There are quite a few interesting experimental games that you spend an hour or two and it's a wonderful experience, and that's it. And then, of course, you have some of the massively multiplayer games where you can put in hundreds or even thousands of hours, and that's fine. But at the time, we were constantly having criticisms that if the game didn't last at least 20 hours and preferably close to 40, they felt that they were being cheated. And that was a huge burden for us on the programming side. So something like the fighting, where you had to repeat it over and over again, but the coding was identical, that was very cost effective for us. Mazes were another thing that, it doesn't take very long to program a maze, but it takes a long time to figure out how to get through it. And yet, even as we made it, we didn't really enjoy playing those parts of the game. So we were constantly struggling between things like, should we put in a shortcut and a way to get around it, as we did in the castle, for example, or is that just going to make people angry because they said, well, I took all the shortcuts and the game was too short, so I didn't like it. So we kept coming up with different ways to deal with that. One of the ways was the indie quotient, which was my idea, which was having points that would show whether you had seen everything possible in the game, including defeating all of the opponents and finding all of the puzzles. And it turned out that the people who tended to complain the most about not getting 40 hours of gameplay were the most likely to have pride in having finished every last part of the game. And that worked out well, because then you had players who wanted a shorter experience and didn't complain. And the ones who did have the shorter experience, if they called into our hint line and said, yeah, the game was too fast. So you got all 800 indie quotient points? Well, no, but, oh, I see. And we had people kind of give guilt to the players who hadn't played all the full indie quotient points. And that worked quite well to get them to go back and keep playing for all of that. But to our preference, we felt that the game should adapt itself and be fun for everyone. And if you like puzzles, and if you like tricks, you should enjoy that. And if you like the fighting, you should be able to enjoy most of that. And that's why with Fate of Atlantis, the fourth game, we tried the different paths that allowed people to concentrate one type of gameplay and not have to do all of the different things together.
And I love the decision you made on Indiana Jones 4, that you had those three paths. But I know that the IQ something is that's something Sascha was focusing on. So I guess that question might fit very well in here.
Every time I see the IQ points, I have to think to Sierra, to the old Sierra games, because in the Sierra games you always saw the points in the upper right corner, I think. And was it inspired by Sierra? But I know you had a special way to the IQ points.
Well, it was, so we had a rivalry with Sierra, and we were actually quite friendly with the other designers, and in fact I'm still friends with quite a few of them. That we have an annual get together where a lot of story game designers meet once or twice a year, and there are many Sierra and LucasArts people there. But at LucasArts, we felt a sense of pride that we thought we were making better games. And
you did.
Well, see, the interesting thing is the Sierra games sold much better in the US,
yes,
but our games sold much better in Europe in general and in Germany in particular. So we're very grateful to our German friends for that. It seems, I still don't know why this is the case, but Germans in general seem to get our games better than anyone else. And it's particularly surprising given that comedy can be so difficult to translate. And it helped quite a bit that Boris Schneider, who did our translation, he was probably the perfect translator. The fact that he had grown up both in Germany and the United States and had been a teenager in the U.S., so he understood the slang and the colloquialisms, but understood German culture. And also, I think, I've been to Germany many times since then, and I think that there is a type of humor, particularly the kind of the sort of insult humor that we had in the Monkey Island games, that Americans and Germans appreciate more than most other cultures. When we tried to translate the Monkey Island games into Japanese, the Japanese translators were horribly offended at the idea that insulting somebody would be funny, and we had to actually take out a few of the jokes. The classic you fight like a dairy farmer and you fight like a cow. They said, "Oh no, that's terrible. You can't do that." And we said, "What do you mean?" It says, "Oh, farmers are held in very high regard in Japan, and to think that it's insulting to be a farmer we'd be in great trouble." So we had to take that out. And in Germany, of course, it was not a problem.
Yeah. But the biggest problem was in the Monkey Ranch. I know.
I see. That one, I think that was a Ron Gilbert thing, and even I think before the game had been out for very long, we realized that was a terrible mistake. But even if you understood what a monkey wrench was, it wasn't a very good puzzle. It was too much of a visual joke. So yes, we're sorry about that one.
No problem. Boris Schneider is told this anecdote at every podcast, and okay.
Yeah.
Did you know Boris Schneider personally?
Oh, sure. I mean, it was a very small company. I mean, when we were working on Last Crusade, I think we probably only had about 20 employees. And the people who came in, to do translation. Boris, more than most, I think he was very involved. We had quite a few people from Germany who were involved. And I don't remember exactly how it happened. I think that it was just coincidence that some Germans had moved to the Bay Area, the people that made Factor 5 games and Toit Wiedemann, actually, he came by and visited very frequently, and he and I are still friends. And Boris, I think, I'm sure he remembers better than I do how the connections happened, but it was just one of those happy things where we got along very well and we enjoyed joking with him. And, I think he came in and was more involved in some of the creativity than I think any of our other translators. Many of our translators we never met because they were translated in their home countries. One of the things we did that Sierra did not do is that we made separate deals with the individual distributors in different countries. So in Germany, Spain, Portugal, even fairly small markets like that, we would work with a company that would distribute only in that country. And they would hire the translator locally in, Spain, for example. So in Sierra games, in a lot of cases, they would outsource it to a company in the UK, where often it was an English language speaker that had learned Spanish as a second language and wasn't very adept in it. We worked with people who their native language was the one that was the target translation language. And of course, in rare cases like with Boris, where you got somebody who is not only bilingual, but had lived in both countries when he was growing up, that was the perfect fit. But it was very hard to find people like that.
He was a very passionate translator, and we've done a podcast about Murder on the Mississippi, released by Activision in 1986, same year with, like Manik mentioned. And we had an anecdote where he said he cracked the game because he said, okay, I can do a localization for Germany, wrote to Activision Hamburg, and they said, we are not interested in having a localization in German. And so he cracked the game, translated it, made the copy protection again on it and sent it to them, and that's how he started having a link to the gaming industry. And we always speculated if that link led him to Lucasfilm games, and he was like, well, that's the guy who cracked the game, and he translated it pretty well. He was working for a gaming magazine here in Germany, the ASM. So Aktueller Spielemarkt, that's the shortage of it. And so he's doing it. He's working still for Microsoft, I guess, not in the gaming department, but in some kind in the other departments. And I thought he has done the translation for Thimbleweed as well.
Yeah, well, that one, so Ron was able to get a lot of the people together from 30 plus years ago to give an authentic feel to that. It was actually a really fun project. I was at Google at the time, and it was disappointing because as happy as I was with my job at Google, it would have been fun to have been more deeply involved with that project. But in fact, with the original Maniac Mansion, I was only peripherally involved anyway, so it was probably an accurate reproduction of all that. David was very heavily involved, and he lives just a few kilometers from here, and I would go over to his house every now and then in the early stages of the game when they were just in the alpha builds, and try it for an hour or two and give him commentary. So I got to at least have a little bit of a sense of watching over his shoulder with that.
Well, I'm sure the localization, which started very early in Germany, was a major part of the success you had in this country, because the translation, I can compare it because I've seen the English version and the German version, is a very good transfer in the kind of humor and in the kind of vocabulary terms which we are using in Germany. And I know it's like an 80s movie. If you see it now, some of the humor has changed and you do not think that's so funny anymore, but it's still entertaining, and some scenes are still hilarious, so given in your adventures. But coming back to Indiana Jones 3, I think it has a lot of humor in it, and it has some funny anecdotes or quotes in it, but it has a more serious tone than the other adventures in the Lucasfilm area, or in the area where they had only the adventure thing being their primary product. So is that caused because it's an action movie originally, or is it more because you had some respect, not damaging the brand, because the humor might go too far? Because when you look at Zack McCracken or Manic Mansion or Day of the Tentacle or the Monkey Island games, sometimes they are pushed to the limit for, let's say, more serious people.
Well, that was really, I think, my doing more than the others. That, as you say, both David and Ron's games tended to be the humor games. And, it's interesting. I hadn't thought about it, but subsequently, as Tim Schafer actually kind of went off on his own, even though there's humor in his games, it became less important over time. So that certainly Tim is one of the funniest guys I know, and I love the humor in games like Psychonauts, for example. I'm really looking forward to Psychonauts 2 that is in the works, but it's much less of the kind of over-the-top slapstick kind that you get in Zack McCracken or Maniac Mansion. And I was actually the advocate for trying to be somewhat more serious with Indiana Jones, because I felt that the tone of the movies was mostly serious with comic relief, and I wanted to recreate that. And we had a debate. I'm sure you've seen the interviews where it turns out that the one thing we couldn't agree on among the three of us was the humor at the end of the game, and I was pushing for playing it fairly seriously like it happens in the movie, and Ron wanted to make it much more sarcastic and humorous, and we ended up, we couldn't agree. Usually among the three of us, we could come to a consensus, and sometimes it would be 2 against 1, but the one person would convince the other 2, so there really was no friction. But that was near the end of the game. I mean, besides being the end of the game, literally, it was also the last scenes that we developed. We saved that for the very end, and we were all tired and we were all pushing against the deadline. And I think if we had had more time, we would have come up with a more elegant solution. But having the text come up randomly one way or another was, a simple way to resolve our conflict. And I remember our boss was a little skeptical, but I think he was also really eager to get the game out in the stores while the movie was still hot. And in general, I think the issue of humor and Indiana Jones. I mean, it's still a difficult one. It's interesting for me to see the debates about the movies and the Crystal Skulls movie and whether that went too far in trying to be funny at certain times. And at any rate, it's a tough one. And since then, all of us have learned a great deal in the last, 30, 35 years. And looking back at some of the decisions we made in those games, I think if we were to redo them now, we'd have a much more subtle approach. It would probably blend more humor into the situations and not depend so much on silly jokes. As you say, even the 80s humor has become dated. And somebody pointed out recently to me that it's now as long between now and the first Indiana Jones movies as it was between the first Indiana Jones movies and the serials that, the 1930s and 40s serials that George and Stephen were basing them on. So it's interesting to see how time has progressed and tastes have changed, and it's time to update. And, certainly the way that women were treated in the movies would be difficult to do in the current day. So that's, things evolve over time.
Well, that's the same what happened to James Bond movies of the 60s and 70s.
Exactly.
That's the same case, yeah.
Oh, I missed them. I would like to get back to the German localization. As we all know, we Germans have a big problem with our past. Of course, I mean World War II and the Nazi regime. Yeah. Nazi symbols have been banned in Germany since the end of the war, unless they are used in a historical context. Games with Nazi symbols.
Since 2018.
Yeah, games with Nazi symbols, however, had a hard time until recently, 2018, and were also banned. Were you aware of this issue in Germany at the development of Indy 3?
Not so much when we started, but certainly as the game developed. There was one artist, Martin Cameron, his nickname was Bucky, whose job it was to do a lot of the artwork set in Germany. And the swastikas, the Hakenkreuz, I remember we learned that name very quickly because it became such a problem. That was certainly, just could not be in the game. And David Fox and I were actually raised Jewish, not particularly observant, but we were certainly sensitive to that, and we were very grateful that Germany has changed so much. But it turned out that we had, that Bucky had created all this artwork, and then he had to spend hours and hours going through the game, making the German version and changing all the crosses. And I still remember hearing him in the other room cursing and swearing as he was, doing this work, and say, "Oh, I found another one." He counted it, and I don't remember what the number was, but it was in the double digits. It was probably around 40 or 50 of them that he had to go in and by hand change all of them in a very short time to get the German version ready. But we felt that any game where you could actually punch Hitler in the face, at least sort of deserved a balanced presentation. Felt we were at least showing that we weren't pushing National Socialism. So it was not something. I mean, what surprised me years later when I was in Hanover working with DTP on some games. I had really interesting conversation about in the 1950s and 60s, there were a lot of stories and movies about secret German bases on the moon, in the Arctic, in a hollow Earth. These were all part of popular fiction in the U.S. and England and other places. And what I found was interesting is none of my German friends had any, knowledge of that until much later, because that was all banned. And I just thought it was ironic that we in the U.S. had much more of a fascination with that. And it was very interesting for me to see how the world has diverged that way. And I was grateful to the fact that German education has been so strong in terms of realizing how terrible that era was. And I only wish that U.S. education was a bit stricter that way, and perhaps we'd be in a better position politically right now.
Yeah.
Well, your current political system and your leader is debatable. Let's say it like this. We
just another question at this. Has this issue been considered in Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis from the beginning? Because when checking through English Let's Plays, I did not notice any Nazi symbol.
Yeah, well, that was the thing. We learned from there that was not worth doing, and we respected the lack of that symbolism. We still thought when Hal Barwood and I were talking about doing Indy 4, we had a lot of freedom to pick a storyline, but the fact was we still felt that, as in the movies, the Nazis were still the sort of most satisfying villain, certainly to American audiences, and we wanted a way to be able to return to that feeling, but to not be, as offensive. And as you say, we were able to, I think, do it without being quite so overt. Part of the problem, of course, was that the Last Crusade movie, he goes to Berlin, and there are, symbolism. In order to be historically accurate, you can't escape that. And it was actually one of the aspects that, Steven Spielberg is a huge World War II buff, as is obvious from his films. And I had a lot of experience with that. And
Schindler's List and James Ryan and everything.
Oh, yeah. No, there's even 1941,
Yeah, correct. It's
popular movie. But I worked on the World War II flight simulators we did, and in particular, Secret Weapons of the Luftwaffe was one of the games that Spielberg absolutely loved. He played that game constantly, and we talked to him quite a bit about it. And that fascination with that whole era is something that I think is very common in the U.S., and it was part of the popular culture in a way that, it still is something that keeps coming up over and over again. It has never really gone away in popularity.
I remember when Iron Sky was released in 2008, 9, 10, people in Germany said it's very creative that the Nazis have left on the dark side of the moon, and that they made an invasion to the Earth. But when I listen to you now, it was a popular topic in the 50s and 60s, and we didn't have any kind of sources where people were relying to it in the review of the movie magazines or anything, because it's completely out of reach for the Germans, except you want to import it, and most of the people do not see any reason for doing so. So we have now some changes in laws. So Mein Kampf could be released again, and there's some swastika ban in games, which is deleted as long as you use it as an artist, like a movie artist, not making any kind of advertisement for the National Socialism. So that's the current state of the law. But it was very interesting to listen to you that it was quite common in the British or American culture to have those points given.
I should say it was always seen as a kind of low culture. Those were the sorts of movies, kind of like the
B-movie.
Yeah, exactly. B-movie is sort of the Japanese Godzilla movies, or the early zombie movies and things. It was kind of an easy way. If you weren't being particularly creative, you would just throw some Nazis in, and they would be the villain. And it's become kind of a cliche that in writing classes they warn you to stay away from that, just because it's been overdone so much. In fact, I have to say that when I've worked in Germany, one of the funnier moments I had, but it was also a kind of a grim moment, was I'll save the mention of the company name, and I've worked for many different companies in Germany now, so it's safe. But I was explaining to the head of a company, I'd been brought in as a consultant to look at a game that was in trouble, and they were saying that they thought they could fix it and still be out in 3 months. And I looked at what was going on, and I told their CEO, I'm really sorry, but 6 months possibly if they really pushed, but even then I would be doubtful it would come out in earlier, in less than a year. And he took that very gravely and said, I see, excuse me. He thought about it. He says, do you mind if I talk to them in German for a while? And I said, oh, no. And he had been perfectly friendly and polite to me, but he just, started yelling at the team. And the funny thing for me is that hearing a German being angry and, seeing their faces turn white, it brought me into the middle of all of these World War II movies I'd been, where it's like, you need to take that hill, you need to, send those panzers in and take out everyone. Exactly. And it just, it was both kind of funny, and yet I could see how dismayed everybody was, and I felt bad for the team because I believed in what they were doing, but they were very inexperienced, and I don't think they realized how hard it was to make the game. But it was funny just in that it felt like I was suddenly in my nightmare of, oh no, I've trapped in Nazi Germany. I just didn't realize it.
Well, we have such a beautiful language, we can transfer it very well.
Well, it is a great language. I'm sure you've seen the things online of comparing words in German to other languages, and for being angry at people, nothing beats German, I think. So
yeah, I guess we are in the top list. Yeah, I agree with you on that point, but we have a very complex language, so I wouldn't recommend it for learning it as a foreigner, except you need it. It's a must need when you're working in Germany, or let's say that you have a German wife, girlfriend, or anything. But otherwise, stay away from our language. Well, that's true. It's really difficult. Coming back to Indiana Jones 3, I thought the solution you had, not sticking to the movie like the main plot and having the same problems like the Indiana Jones movie character Harrison Ford, was done perfectly, because when I played it first, I have seen the movie before, and I was that's the scene, and you haven't had seen the solution of the puzzles within the movie. So who made most of the puzzles, and do you remember some puzzles where you were jamming them, or where you couldn't get any progress? And some other thing, I know that the end of the game, which Grail you pick out of those 10, is a random choice. So you had some replayability because the algorithms changed in the background. And I thought that was kind of a high replayability option in that part of the series as well. So can you tell us some backgrounds about that?
Sure. Well, it is, for one thing, memories do fade. It's interesting as we get together and talk among ourselves, the developers of the game. It's interesting to see how sometimes we have contradictory memories. It's not surprising. It's just the way that it works. But often what will happen is we'll get a fan who will ask us about some solution to a puzzle. And not only do we not remember the solution, but sometimes I have no memory of even creating the puzzle in the first place. So it's difficult. It would be fun to have David, Ron, and I together to see remember if we could trigger each other's memories that way. I was responsible for programming the puzzle on the floor in Venice, where you had all the different Roman numerals on the floor. And I do remember that was an interesting one, where the solution in the movie, we couldn't go with that direct solution because it would be too obvious to the players. But we wanted something that captured the same feel of that and yet was much more of a puzzle. And also, as you say, we spent a lot of time trying to look at replayability, because even though this was, it wasn't technically pre-internet, but it was pre-World Wide Web. And there were some online services where people could get on and trade solutions, and certainly the magazines would do that, and they would rush to get the magazine out. So we didn't want to have it be easy for people to look up a solution to a puzzle in a magazine, and having puzzles that were numerical or had some random element in them were something that we worked on quite a bit, of trying to figure out ways to, on the one hand, if it was purely random, then it wasn't very much fun because the player would just have to guess. And on the other hand, if you could deduce it through an algorithm, then they could just publish the algorithm in a magazine. And so we were constantly looking for interesting ways to sort of blend those two. And, you know, often we had ways in games where there was something that was reproducible and predictable within a given game, but what that solution was would change from one game to another, and so that it could be reasoned out logically by the person playing the game. But if they gave that solution to someone else, the random numbers would come up differently and the solution wouldn't work for them. And so that was even to this day, of course, game designers try to look for those sorts of things, all the more so now because you can share information instantly online. So there's always a challenge to come up with interesting ways to make things replayable and fresh for someone and not give it all away. And yet you do want to be able to give hints to people. So it's a very interesting balancing act, and game designers, you know, talk about that all the time. Beyond that, you know, I'm afraid I don't really remember too much. I do know that several of the action elements that we added into the games were to add that kind of reproducibility, you know, like the machine gun when you're in the biplane. You know, that was actually another one that I worked on myself and kind of came into the World War II, you know, flight simulator work I was doing. It just felt like it was an exciting era, you know, where you know, the image of being a tail gunner in a plane was kind of a fun fantasy, and it was a way to make it skill-based so that you would, you know, most players would have to try it a number of times before they kind of figured out the trick to, you know, properly leading the target and not shooting up your own plane, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that was very difficult. I remember that flight sequence, and I think I've never reached the end of it, but I came pretty far in it.
Well, that was the problem we had, is that people, since some people are just not that, you know, fond of the action puzzles, we had to come up with ways around them. But it was a chicken and egg problem, as you said, like with avoiding some of the fighting by talking past the guards. If that became too easy, it wasn't very satisfying. And on the other hand, if it was too difficult, it became very frustrating. And it's another kind of basic problem that game designers on a very abstract level were constantly caught between being boring if it's too easy and being frustrating if it's too hard. And there's a concept called the flow channel that's a psychological concept that most game designers are very interested in, because it's a way of finding a path between boredom and frustration on either end.
I think it's a thin line to be entertaining or to be stuck into the game. I think talking about adventures today, one of the biggest issues I see of the genre is that when you have a ton of games released today, thousands and thousands of games, and at least 2 dozen or 3 dozen AAA titles. So if you're a passionate gamer, or let's say if you're a gamer going on games as a service, you want to have a flow, like you said. And if you're stuck to a puzzle, I remember back in the 90s, I put out the computer and I was not angry, but I was a bit frustrated, and I thought, how does it go? And next time I started, I had an idea what I haven't done, or I made some kind of clicking, that's the way it works, and then you have a progress in the storyline. And I think most of the people haven't got that frustration level where they say, okay, now I'm stuck in a kind of way. I tried it 4 or 5 times, I uninstall it. And I think that's the problem having that's a problem the adventure genre has today. And going the way like the Telltale games did, or the Quantic Dreams team did with Detroit now with the last release, try to avoid that problem, but they have kind of they play more like an interactive movie, and they are missing those typical game elements people are looking for. If you read the negative critics about those games, I like them, by the way. But if you read the negative reviews, they always say, well, that's not a game. I bought a season of a series or of a movie, and I was entertained, but it didn't feel like playing a game. Like Bandersnatch on Netflix.
Well, exactly. I mean, it's a debate, as you say, that is constantly going on, and yeah, I still haven't. I was going to say played. I guess that's probably accurate, or watched Bandersnatch yet. It's very high on my list to do, but I really want to not just absorb it, but study it and see some of the choices they've made. And I haven't been able to help but hear, from my friends of some of the work that they did. I do consider that a bit of a victory, though, because when Lucasfilm was just starting in games, as I said, it was a tiny part of their revenue, and even we on the game side never really hoped that games would grow to be as big as movies, much less bigger in terms of money. At best, we hoped to gain some respect because we loved the movies. I mean, everybody at Lucasfilm Games came to the company because they were a fan of the Lucasfilm movies, and we loved being able to hang out with the filmmakers and get to see the special effects being made, and it was a great inspiration to us. But I think it's gratifying now to see that the linear media like movies and books have become co-equal, certainly with games, or games have come to the point where you can enjoy a game as much as a movie, and they spend as much on the games as they do on the movies, and both in terms of making them and paying to see them. And it makes me happy to see that we've kind of progressed to that point.
Yeah, those borders are diminishing, which you had. This is a movie which is very clear, and you had that as a game, and which very clear they are kind of getting closer and closer to each other.
Well, and I'll say one of my personal predictions for virtual reality is that the big breakthrough in consumer VR is going to come from not from games, but from somewhat interactive movies, movies where you have some degree of choice, but the story progresses no matter what you do. When I was at Google, they have a project called Spotlight Stories that has spawned, I think, 15 or so different little mini 360-degree games. The games, I mean, it's very hard to quantify them because they're stories that progress, but they have Easter eggs, they have variants in, much like we've discussed. One in particular I thought was very clever early on. It was called Special Delivery, that's done by Aardman Films, who do the Wallace and Gromit movies. And not a lot of people are familiar with these spotlight stories, but I really think it's the core of a way that virtual reality can blend interactivity with filmmaking and storytelling, and use what virtual reality does best of immersing you in a world that feels very real and feels like it's interactive in the sense that you can turn your head and choose to see things and not be caught with what the director and the camera believed in. So I'm very excited about the future of interactive storytelling still having a great deal of room to move and experiment, particularly with virtual and augmented reality.
I think you are right about that. The best thing, I think the thing with virtual reality is you have the glasses on and you cannot interact with the people beside you. So it's not a party game media. You need to have something where you are story focused, or where you have something like freedom of movement in a limited room, like those horror games do with Resident Evil or something like this. So I think your prediction is kind of realistic for that genre, or for that technique. But we are having. I've had a message of Sascha that he's checking
running
the time.
Out of time. Yeah.
Yes, of course.
And I see we have already made a 70 minutes interview on my Audacity recording. So let's continue with focusing on the Indiana Jones series.
I think
Sascha, do you have a question?
No, I think the most questions are answered gladly.
I have a one question inside of here. Is it something like did you play jokes on each other during the development, or did you integrate something like I know you were under time pressure, but did you have some rituals while developing it?
Oh, it's a really interesting question. You know, I think the answer is yes, but it's hard to remember the details. That the Indiana Jones games were made, well, at least The Last Crusade was made in the time that our games group was at Skywalker Ranch. That was a period of just 4 years. And it was, I think, you know, the happiest time of the group. It was one of our most creative periods, and the company was expanding rapidly. And we had all sorts of, sort of jokes and rituals, as you would say. I mean, one of the things that came up with The Last Crusade is that since there were 3 of us who were leading the project, and we were all programmers and all storytellers and, you know, kind of involved in every piece of it all, we would get into sometimes debates about things. And sometimes the way that we would debate is that I would see what Ron had done and I'd just go in and change it. And then the next day I'd come and he'd changed it back, or David had done something else. And we tried not to get too distracted with that because, of course, we never would have finished the game. But sometimes, you know, we would put comments in the code that were aimed at just each other. I wish I had an exact example to give you. I just remember that you know, rather than actually change the code, I would make a sarcastic remark in the comments, and sometimes, you know, I'd come back and see that Ron had responded to it with his own comment. And you know, it was you know, a shame that we weren't able to share all of that. You know, in fact, I doubt the source code even exists. You know, hopefully somebody has you know, squirreled away some copy of it, but the floppy disks we were using and the workstations that we're using are all obsolete now. So it'd be very hard to find any of that work. But we also did, Skywalker Ranch was just an absolutely amazing place to work. It was, it still is, you know, I was just actually out there a few weeks ago, and it's absolutely beautiful. It's, you know, set out in the countryside here in Marin County, and the buildings are all beautiful buildings that George built according to a storyboard plan, so that they look like they were built, you know, 100, 150 years ago, but they were all put together in the 80s and more recently. So there were a lot of little things like encounters with wildlife. You know, occasionally there would be a snake in the courtyard, and we would call our groundskeepers to come in and capture the snake. And, you know, I remember at one point, he was really happy because, oh, this is a gopher snake. That's great. And I said, well, what's great about that? So, well, we're having problems with gophers that, you know, were popping up and eating all the expensive vegetation. So they then capture the snake and bring it to one of the gopher holes and drop it in the problem solved. And at one point, I remember going to open the door to the other side of the building and seeing that there was a spider on the handle. And, you know, I was going to brush it aside, and I thought, oh, it's a really shiny black spider, and it crawled away, and I could see that it had a little red hourglass on it, and it was, oh, this is a black widow spider. You know, it's one of the only 2 types of poisonous spiders that we have in the U.S. And nobody was ever, to my knowledge, bitten by one, but we got very careful about spider webs and you know, brushing them away.
That's interesting. Did you? I've played Manic Mansion and Zack McCracken on the C64, and I know the machine was limited, and you see the graphical development and the size of the game expanding on Indy 3. So when did you decide not to go for the C64 anymore? Because when you see some quotes of Ron Gilbert, he says it's his most favorite machine ever. So was piracy a problem, or what,
it was a problem? It was really, though, the whole decision behind that was purely financial. When I was there early on, we were starting with the Atari 800, and, you know, we all felt that it was a superior machine to the Commodore 64 in a number of ways. But Yeah, well, and the graphics in particular, we had 128 colors instead of the really limited 16 that were available, as well as, you know, just a number of things that the Atari we thought did better. But we saw that the Commodore 64, because it was less expensive, was rapidly outselling the Atari 800 in the US, certainly, and I think worldwide. And so I was working on Coronis Rift in 85, 86. And our boss said, you know, we're going to have to hire somebody to work on the C64 version of this. And that's how Ron got into Lucasfilm. That actually hired him to be the Commodore 64 specialist on Coronis Rift. And it doesn't surprise me that that was his favorite machine, because that was the one that he really learned first, and that was the one that got him his big break in the industry. David Fox and I both preferred the Atari 800, but then now, you know, 4 or 5 years later, the Commodore 64 was starting to lose out to the IBM compatibles that had very quickly taken over in terms. And again, it was probably not, certainly for games, it wasn't the best machine out there. It was better in terms of having a lot more memory, but it wasn't really seen as a game machine. The IBM and Microsoft people were very reluctant to put in features to help gamers, because they wanted to have people see it as a business machine. And yet, ironically, the games industry was part of what made it a successful business machine, because if it wasn't for the games industry pressing for better graphics cards, they never would have had the kind of graphics they needed for really beautiful spreadsheets and professional artwork and all the things that started to creep in the late 80s and early 90s. So it was purely a matter of sales numbers on the Commodore going down that led us to abandon it. The Amiga and Atari ST were starting to take off, so we were switching to those for a while, and then the PC and Macintosh pretty much completely dominated the market, and you know, we lost those other projects.
Yeah, the early 90s were the death of the home computer scene, which was very big, or which was blooming in the 80s. And the Amiga came to an end in 1994-5. So Indiana Jones 4 was the last game released by LucasArts for it, I guess.
Well, I'll give you another interesting bit of trivia that before I came to Lucasfilm, I was working for Williams Electronics on arcade games. And I did an arcade game called Sinistar. And on Sinistar, I hired the most junior programmer, was just a guy we brought in who had never worked on games, but we brought him in to do essentially special effects, and his name is RJ Michael. And I became friends with RJ when the arcade industry started to collapse. We both came out to California at the same time. I came to Lucasfilm. He came to Amiga, and he wrote the operating system for the original Amiga computer. And so, you know, I had friend ties to, you know, the development of the Amiga. Years later, he was the one who got a job at Google and then brought me in to work at Google. As with my friends at LucasArts, a lot of cases we kind of trade these you know, friendships back and forth, and invite each other to work on games and such. And one last anecdote of crossing these things together, that at the Consumer Electronics Show many years ago, we would have a big presence from LucasArts, and we would have a dinner at one of the restaurants there. And I asked if I could bring my friend RJ along, and they said, oh, sure. And RJ came and had dinner with us, but he got into a food fight, basically. He started throwing food first at other people at our table, and then somebody dared him to throw food at somebody at another table, and he did that. And the restaurant wasn't very happy with us, and I was told, you know, sorry, but he's no longer invited to any of our company dinners after that. So I had cause to regret it.
Yeah, that's a part of, with the Amiga boys, they couldn't, with the Amiga. Yeah, that's part with the Amiga boys, they couldn't stand that their system was buried in the 90s and not developed anymore.
Yeah, so. Well, much like the Atari, and you know, it was based on some of the same chips. It was technically a better machine, but it was also more expensive. And over again, we've seen that given to, I mean, right now we're seeing it in terms of the numbers of Android phones versus iPhones, that the iPhone tends to be sort of high quality, very impressive, but there are
declining market shares,
phones, out in the world. And it's mostly a cost thing.
Yeah.
Well, that's the last point I'm asking about Indiana Jones 3. If you have any, Sascha, you may come up with, but my last point would be, do you know the number in sales of Indiana Jones 3 and 4? And can you remember how you made how was the feedback? The reviews in the magazines were good or extremely good, and the feedback inside of the company, out of the three head developers, the owners, Spielberg, some people who were working in other projects, saying, okay, that's something great you did, or I had problems with this and that. So do you remember sales, and do you remember the feedback inside the company?
Well, the sales numbers, I'm not sure. Let's see. It was somewhere in the order of several 100,000, maybe 200,000 or 300,000 units, I think, that we sold at that point. I remember specifically, let's see, the number 250,000 is coming to mind, but I'm not absolutely sure that was accurate for Indy 3. Indy 4 I remember better because that was the first game, and in fact the only adventure game that ever broke 1 million units at LucasArts. Even years later, things like Grim Fandango that got amazingly good reviews didn't sell anywhere near as well as that. And the combination of the Indiana Jones license and I think the quality of the game kind of reached its peak there with Fate of Atlantis. I'm not saying that was necessarily the very best game, but it was certainly the best quality with a really high quality license as well, and managed to do both of those at once. And I was very proud of the fact that even though that wasn't based on a movie, it actually outsold the game that was, so that was a point of pride. But in general, in terms of reviews, in terms of respect from our fellow game developers, even in our competing companies, the Indiana Jones games, I think to this day, people look back at them very fondly. Last Crusade is still held up as one of the very few games that was based on a movie that held up and didn't feel like it was just made to capitalize on the movie and just make some money, but really was enjoyed to the same degree as watching the movie and playing the game.
It's not a cash grab. I definitely agree, and I like both games. And I think Indiana Jones 4 is the progressed, better game, the more polished game, even because you had more experience and you had some other projects running and you had more time to develop the game. And
and Hal, who's the project leader, coming from a screenwriting background, I learned so much about screenwriting and dialogue and camera from him, but it was a really nice collaboration because I was assigned to work with him because he didn't know games, and the two of us have stayed friends ever since and learned a great deal from each other, and were able to bring together the games and interactivity and storytelling in a more integral and organic way, I think, than very few other games have been able to do.
And don't forget the really great talkie version of it. The talkie version was really, really great. It was my first CD-ROM game, Indy 4, and I loved it.
Well, and again, Hal was invaluable to us in understanding how to do working with actors and getting good performances out of them. And it was really intriguing to blend the filmmaking and the gameplay and find ways where they worked together perfectly and other ways where they clashed. One last anecdote about that is that working on Indy 4, Hal and I were talking about following two characters with the camera and having them talk to each other while the camera was having them walk by. And my first thought was to have the characters go from, sort of left to right across the screen. I mean, have them stay in the center of the screen, but pan the scenery behind them, because that was technically the easiest thing to do. And he said, "Oh, no, we need to have the characters come towards the camera and have landscape recede into the background behind them. And I said, well, that'll be difficult. Why is that so important? And he says, well, psychologically, if someone is walking away from you or parallel to you, it's not very interesting. When it looks like they're walking right towards you, it activates a part of your brain that says, this is really important. I need to pay attention to this. And it was one of those subtle things that since then I've looked at movies and I realized that the ways that characters walk and where they position the camera, how high the camera is and whether it's looking down or looking up, all of that is critical to the way that movies feel to you. And we were very slow at first to adopt that into games, and having filmmakers like Hal show us how that was done was really invaluable.
I saw some interviews you gave with on websites as text interviews, and you gave a lot of credit to Hal Bearwood, what you have learned about making correct scenes, having good dialogues, having a good pace of the story and everything like that. So it looks like the perfect fit. And I must agree that the Indiana Jones 4, The Fate of Atlantis, is one of the strongest Lucasfilm games, LucasArts games, in my opinion. So I think it's even better than the game we have talked about. But it's still like looking back in the days and being back in 1989, I think it's a very high quality game. And most of that's what I was talking about when we started the interview. Most of the games which were linked to a franchise being a movie were one-shots and a cash grab for many people. And that's definitely not the case for LucasArts. Did you have any feedback of Steven Spielberg about Indiana Jones games?
Oh yeah, he was very fond of them. He, as I said, he would, he asked for hints, and rather than give him our hint line number, we actually gave him our direct lines of the three of us who were project leaders. And I'd say I just learned from David Fox recently that he didn't get very many of the calls. I think Ron and I, for various reasons, ended up fielding most of those calls. But I remember in particular, Stephen called us at one point, and I was on the phone, and he was talking about going through the Castle Grunwald in the game. And his son Max was on his lap, and one of the ways you can trick the Nazis is to put on a Nazi uniform and sneak past them. And suddenly Max was crying, and Stephen's saying, "It's okay, Max, it's okay. Indy's not a Nazi. It's just a trick. It's just a trick." But Max was really upset to see that he'd gone over to the bad guys. And actually, Max Spielberg is now a game developer. So clearly those early video games were a positive experience. But yeah, Stephen, I went to work for DreamWorks later and got to work with him again directly on several projects there. And he is an absolute, he's one of us in terms of games. He just loves to play video games of all sorts, has put in many thousands of hours, in his life. And often, would play multiplayer games with a pseudonym. So there are a lot of people in like Air Warrior, the early flight simulator, who had the privilege of being shot down by Steven Spielberg and never realized it.
Yeah, that's interesting. Did he ever show interest in making a movie out of Indiana Jones 4, Fate of Atlantis?
No, and I, as much as I flattered that a lot of people have said it would have been a good idea, I did get to work with both Stephen and George Lucas together on an early version of The Dig, and running creative sessions with the two of them as partners and contributors was great. But it made me realize how they have movies in their brain so thoroughly that the kind of quality that they do in filmmaking, we could never approach that with the story from the video game. Just as I think, the best games are not made based on movies. You really need to have something original that uses the best of interactivity and gameplay. So I really respect what they do, and I am grateful that they're making their own way with those choices.
But I disagree on that fact, because some people are making out of a storyline, out of one sentence, a whole franchise, or doing Transformers 10 parts, and making out of a Disney park a Curse of the Caribbean. Pirates of the Caribbean is a series with 6 major parts. So, and to be honest, the Crystal theme on Indy 4 would have been the better story, taking Fate of Atlantis, maybe. So that's why I was disagreeing.
Everybody makes mistakes from time to time, and there is that.
Yeah. One thing is interesting for me, because you said the sales number were roughly 200,000, and as I looked up on Steam Spy, it's not totally exact, but the games Indy 3 and Indy 4 have 100 to 200,000 registered copies within Steam today.
Oh, I was talking about sales when they were brand new, in the first two. Yeah. Correct. No, it definitely. Well, for example, the Monkey Island games have sold, even in paid versions, many more copies since they were upgraded to the expanded editions, and people have bought them for tablets and phones and computers. And it's really interesting for me to come to conferences and have somebody who's 23 come to me and say, "Oh, I'm a huge fan of the Indiana Jones games," and to realize that they weren't even born. Even their parents were probably sometimes too young to play those games. So it's amazing to see how a lot of those games have remained popular and played by new players, and not just by those of us who saw them 20, 30 years ago.
You made everything right.
Have you ever been asked to do an enhanced or special edition about Indy 3 or Indy 4? Because I think the problem is, when you look at some of the Monkey Island series or anything, Disney isn't interested in pushing those brands back to life again. But
it was starting to happen when those first Monkey games were done, the first expanded editions were done. Daryl Rodriguez was head of Lucasfilm, LucasArts rather, and he was very keen on doing a lot of those versions. But LucasArts had a problem where just about every 2 to 3 years they would have a decision that they needed to replace their CEO. And it often didn't work well for them. And often the first thing the new CEO would do would be to throw away all the work the last one had done. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, after Daryl left, a lot of the plans he had to do more of these classic games, they said, "Oh, no, we are only going to do new games." And, by the time that CEO was gone, we started talking to the next one. That was about the time that it got bought by Disney, and suddenly there was no interest, as you say. And I still have hopes that kind of thing might happen at some point in the future. And certainly Tim Schafer's had some success in being able to get some of the rights to do stuff like the expanded versions he's done. So it might happen, but we'll see. I mean, Ron and David and I had a brief discussion about whether, when Ron was working on Thimbleweed Park, whether we might talk to Spielberg about doing a retro game version of the next Indiana Jones film that's in the works now. And given that Stephen loved those games, I suppose that's possible. But it occurred to us that the budget.
I hope so.
Well, the budget for Thimbleweed Park style game would be a small part of the marketing budget for a movie like the next Indiana Jones movie. So we still have had some discussions that might be a fun thing to do. But I think Ron is a little burnt out on doing retro games right now. So we'd have to persuade him if we wanted to get him involved on that. And it would be great to have the three of us back together on that project.
That would be perfect. And I know we're close to ending the interview, because when I look at the time scale, we are 90 minutes.
I do need to go now.
At 92 minutes. So can we finish the next 5 minutes? So we're stuck to the timetable. Sure. Yeah. You said you come over to Germany for having some audience speaking in front of it in 2019, together with David and Ron. Can you tell us where you will appear? Because we both might be interested in joining you if it's possible.
We're actively pursuing that now, but I'd rather not say until we resolve that, because I don't want, for one thing,
it's inofficial.
Yeah,
so
well, and there are several different conferences that are possibilities, some in Germany, some in other countries, and we may do more than one, but until we have that for sure, but we'll definitely let people like you know, because we want to spread the word as much as possible when it gets to that.
That's great. So just write me a short email or give me a short info, and we would be happy joining you, or we would be happy reporting about that event. That's one point. And another one would be, I've heard that between the lines that you would do an enhanced version if you are asked about it. But let's say you have a gaming career of 35 years and it's a much bigger span than the Indiana Jones thing. Coronis Rift is a classic one of the early 80s. And you've done some other works like On the Dig. I wanted to ask you about that game as well. I know that you were in the pre-development phase or in the early development phase, but that's a kind of strange product of LucasArts regarding their adventures. And if there's a chance doing another interview when we are coming up with another LucasArts games, we would be happy if you have a time for us again. And asking you about that's my last question. If you have the chance to pick one product, what kind of franchise would you pick? Would you do a Star Wars game or an Indiana Jones game? Or no matter of costs and no matter if it has to be successful or not, which genre and what kind of, or would it be a revival of an old game idea which was restricted because of the technique, and you would do it in another way? Today, most of the time, not the hardware is the limit. Most of the time, it's the creativity or some other points, the costs or anything like this. So if you have enough money, which kind of brand would you pick and which genre would it be? You do not have to look at major monetary success. Otherwise, I know roughly the answer.
Well, it's a tough one. I think one of the things that's changed since earlier in my career is that I've become a lot more aware of the whole experience of making a game. And when you ask that, I find in my mind, I'm thinking, oh, it would be fun to work on this. And then I think, oh, yes, but that would also mean a year or two of 80-hour weeks and exhaustion. And I've gotten old enough that I'm not willing to kind of let the rest of my life completely go away. So I kind of think of those things, which I mean, it was one of the things that I liked about Fate of Atlantis was that Hal and I had a wonderful time on the design, and he ended up having to do a lot of the real dirty work of getting the game out the door as the project leader. So, I feel like he got the harder job, certainly, of the two of us. I would say I certainly don't. I have many ideas that I've thought over the years might be fun to do. I guess the one, I've mentioned this in other interviews, that way back in even the early 80s, I was talking to Steve Arnold, our boss, about making a game I was calling The Science of Magic, where you cast spells, and this is before Harry Potter, but very much in that kind of feeling. But the difference is that I had this idea of working out kind of an actual scientific basis of how magic would work, which would mean that if you made a mistake in casting a spell, it might have unintended but reproducible consequences. So you could discover new spells simply by experimenting, but just like in a lot of stories, if you made a mistake and summoned a demon, the consequences could be pretty dangerous. And in today's market with virtual or augmented reality, I think there's some even more interesting possibilities, because with augmented reality, for example, and hand tracking, you could actually cast the spells through hand motion, or with voice recognition be using incantations or some kind of combination, and see things in the real world popping up with you. And I would say, if I wasn't, afraid of being completely drained and exhausted, that's the kind of direction I would go.
I understand that, yes. Well, I can understand the time issue, because if you are having a crunch time, or if you're having a week with 60, 70, 80 hours to go, it's very stressful, and it's not the healthiest way to to stay in the gaming business for another 20 years, let's say, if you are willing to do so.
Of course.
So I can understand that answer. But I was always wondering, I know that I said my last question was already, but I was always...
This is the real last one.
Yeah, my last one. Do you have any questions left, Sascha? So I will
No,
give it
definitely
over to you.
not. Definitely not.
Okay.
Yeah.
My last question would be, there was never a Star Wars adventure, and the adventures were the thing, or the big thing of LucasArts in the 90s. Why? I think it's easy to tell a Star Wars story without having too many action sequences in it. You have some kind of humor inside of the movies as well. So why was there never an approach doing it?
There actually were a couple of proposals and experiments. One of the most interesting things, I think, was that the Ultima series of games that Origin was doing, is even before they were part of Electronic Arts. We had a lot of respect for what they did. We actually had a lot of friendship with the people over at Origin Systems. And Richard Garriott came to us and expressed interest in doing a Star Wars game on the Ultima engine and doing a role-playing game. And they actually got fairly far along in talks about the possibility of doing that. But ultimately, we weren't able to come to a business decision. And even, I think part of it was that even within the company, the adventure games, as we've determined, didn't sell terribly well. I mean, they did well at the time, but they weren't the biggest cash maker for the company. And other types of games like the first-person shooter games like Dark Forces ended up making more money. And we had to pay our licensing group for Indiana Jones or Star Wars, just like outside groups did, which made it less profitable for us as a division. And so that made it an interesting thing where it was actually better to leave those licenses to third parties. And we had developed a lot of pride in our own intellectual properties. So ultimately, I think what kept us from doing that was that combination of financial pressure and wanting to have the creative freedom to come up with totally new stories and characters rather than basing it on existing ones.
I thought about this as a logical answer as well as a fan, but I think that there is a kind of if you have the chance doing it because no one has access to the rights, I would have said, okay, we try our luck. But I understand your answer, and I think that's pretty logical and pretty reasonable to decide that way. Like I said, last question, and I'd say thank you very much for doing the interview, having the time with you. It was a very nice contact with you even before the interview, and you stuck to your words, and we really appreciate it because we have kind of 36 people listening to the podcast and roughly the same amount of viewers on YouTube, subscribers. So we know that we are not the biggest ones, and that's not our target, being big or anything like that. We just want to talk to the heroes of our youth, and you made it possible. And we had great hours with your games, and we had a very good time with you now for 90 minutes. And if we ever come back to a LucasArts project of the past or of any kind of games you did, we would be happy if you have some more time. But I can tell you, we normally do 5 to 6 podcasts, and we have a wide range of experience playing those games in the 80s. So we won't come back in 2019 or 20.
Okay.
But we might call you within 2 or 3 years, and we would be happy if you have another 90 minutes or, let's say, focusing on another project.
Okay. I appreciate it. Thank you. It's been a pleasure talking to both of you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.